Hello and welcome to You Are Medicine. I'm your host, Thuy Nguyen, and today I'm talking to Stephen Jenkinson about elderhood and death. Stephen Jenkinson describes himself as a culture activist. He's an author, teacher, storyteller, and co-creator and instructor of the Orphan Wisdom School. I came to know about him through his award-winning book, Die Wise, a manifesto for sanity and soul, where he writes about death and dying in North America's death-phobic culture. His extensive experience working with dying people and their families as a former program director at a major Canadian hospital has informed him about the consequences of a death-phobic culture on the dying and their families. When I came across his work on dying around 5 years ago, it felt like a refreshingly sober look at the thing we typically avoid looking at, yet is inevitable for all of us: death. I was thrilled that Stephen accepted an invitation to conversation with me, and together we were able to wonder out loud, as he likes to call it, about dying, death, elders, and wisdom amidst what he calls the dominant culture of North America. I would like to talk about this idea of the thinning of the veil. If you had any thoughts about death during this time, what is the veil? What's on this side? What's on the other side?
Well, anybody who speaks with authority on this matter who's still alive should be held at some distance, I think. Educated guesses, disciplined inquiry, they're very called for. But opinions, not so much, I don't think. But I was at the deathbed of a lot of people. I saw a lot of people die. I saw a lot of dead people. I saw a lot of people who were dying absolutely certain that they weren't dying. I saw a lot of people die in the most miserable, conceivable way possible, by virtue of their refusal to be dying people, by virtue of their exercise of the out clause that the dominant culture of North America makes available to everyone. You too can refuse to die. What I saw, and it's a generalization, but it really holds, that people die pretty much in the way that they lived. But somebody listening to this might expect that dying is such an enormous event that it must naturally and inevitably craft a different person out of the dying person. It rearranges their priorities. They see the light. Certain things are available to them that weren't before. Nothing could be further from the truth. If you have not lived as if you're going to die, then your dying is not the opportunity for your best self to come forward. Quite the contrary. Your refusal to be a dying person will be the thing that it's most manifest. Because you've always refused to be a dying person. Because you don't believe in limits, and you don't believe in endings, and you don't believe in not being totally in charge of your little life. And the North American mania for self-control and for mastery makes your death an enemy to you.
As I listened to Stephen's description of the type of unnecessarily prolonged, agonizing death process that he's witnessed over and over again, I had a mix of feelings. For one, I wanted to hear it because it felt important that someone say some direct stuff about something so consequential to all of us. I could hear truth in the connections he was making with the end-of-life struggles and what he calls the dominant culture of North America. That if our lives are lived in the belief that we can control everything, then surely we will refuse and resist and be in denial of the ultimate thing we cannot control, no matter how hard we try: our death. And still it was difficult to hear of the painful struggles of people at the end of their lives and to hear the connections being made, not because I want to be in denial of it, but because it felt too bare bones. I can appreciate that Stephen is direct, if not strident, precisely because he sees our looking away as a huge part of the problem. But I wasn't sure that stating things so unilaterally and harshly without attributing any wisdom to the dying or their family or the culture would contribute to the healing of the culture. This feeling of ambivalence stayed with me the entire interview as I struggled to both acknowledge the wisdom and knowledge that Stephen was generously offering, as well as affirm that my own uneasiness is also pointing towards a wisdom of its own.
When you are the product of a culture that believes in belief, that believes in the notion that you can believe anything you want, and as long as you believe it and it works for you, then it's bound to be good, and only good things can come from that. I mean, one of the first casualties is tradition, because the dominant culture of North America does not prepare anyone for the notion that your dying is bigger than your beliefs about dying. There's no capacity. There's no readiness. The closest they get is insurance policies, right? That they double down on their beliefs. They don't take instruction from their dying. Their dying is automatically an adversary that they have to contend with or defeat and things of this kind. This is where you get the notion of fighting. So what if dying is actually bigger in every conceivable sense of the term than the thoughts that you can manage about it? What if your dying is not that interested in your beliefs about it? And what if it's not your dying at all? What if it's dying that's been entrusted to you in the same fashion that life was entrusted to you for a while, to take care of and to nurture? And when you lay it down, it should be in better condition when you lay it down than when you picked it up, as the world should be properly. And I think it's proper that we hold ourselves to that standard, that this world should be a better place by virtue of us having lived in it than not. And I don't see much evidence that people are proceeding seriously, taking that as a personal responsibility. Does it come from their personal beliefs? It comes from the repertoire made available to them by the culture they were born into.
After our interview, I realized that I hadn't asked Stephen to define what he means when he refers to the dominant culture of North America. Since there were so many references made to it, I did some research to find his definition in his own words and found this written in an essay from 2013. The dominant culture was not built as if the last 500 years on these shores had happened. It was built in spite of those years. It was built with a shrug to the past and with the view that the past is gone. That is the principal reason for its ending. A culture unwilling to know its ragged, arbitrary origins is fated to a kind of perpetual, uninitiated adolescence, and it is by this adolescent spirit of privilege and entitlement and dangerous amnesia that our culture is known in the world. Real culture is not built on bad myths of superiority or inevitability or victory. It is built by people willing to learn and to remember the stories that slipped from view, the rest of the truth that the empire won't authorize. Reading this gave me insight into the ground from which Stephen's work as a culture activist grew. While I was not born into the dominant culture, I spent most of my life here, and so I'm quite familiar with and affected by the deliberate amnesia and privilege that Stephen references, but in different ways as a person of color. I am aware of how being raised in such a culture, I'm also conditioned by it, but not as the entitled or privileged dominant group, more as the one dominated by, in deference to, and adjusting to the dominant group. While I don't consider myself an activist with a capital A, I do my best to not contribute in ways that reinforce and enable patterns of privilege and entitlement. It was important for me to bear in mind that the dominant culture not only informs our thoughts and attitudes towards death and dying, but also life and living in practically every moment. To change a cultural programming of control and dominance on one's deathbed is near impossible. To try to change it before then requires first an examination of the conditioning in one's own life. A culture run by the myth that one can control one's life by beliefs that are disconnected from the things that are inseparable from one's life, like history, what was done so we can have the life we have, ancestors, the people entangled with this history, nature, that which sustains our very flesh and being, and the great mystery from which all these things come. A culture that has replaced these realities with human-centric beliefs of dominion will have to reckon with these forces when that human and that dominion necessarily comes to an end during death. In a death-phobic culture, phobia is the deviance here, as death is natural. Phobia, fear. I don't believe that fear is a sudden visitor when we die. It's actually a constant companion in the dominant North American culture. In life, it looks like control, dominance, and mastery. In death, it looks like terror and denial. What would life and death be like informed by something other than fear?
In the northern hemispheres of the world, when people are ancestrally finding a way to live out the dying of the leaves on the trees, the immense shift from abundance and general ease and creaturely comfort and all the rest to within 3 months from now in a world that could kill you if you're not properly dressed. I mean, that's very extreme change. And the poetics and the mythologies of the peoples who are ancestrally from these places reflects those kinds of extremes. And so, I don't know about other parts of the world, but I think when we come to the dying time in the world around us, it wouldn't be surprising that we feel the presence of some kind of other world in a way that we don't feel when everything's green and bounteous and you can pluck the fruit from the trees.
Wouldn't that be similar to our inability to feel our death when it's not quite here yet? When you talk about death, inside me, I most understand it like birth. I've given birth to 3 children. And during my birth experience, I had the very distinct feeling, especially the first time, and I didn't realize it was like that birth was going to happen. I wasn't actually giving birth. It's a force that happens through me. And prior to that, I thought that I was giving birth. I thought that I was pushing a baby out. And because I had the good fortune of having that experience unmedicalized and at my home, I could feel maybe that it's similar with death, that death is something that happens aside from me willing or my experience with death. It just happens. So I think about that. I also think about wintertime, if death isn't my experience with death, but that death is something beyond that, like the seasons, like winter's going to happen, regardless of how I feel about winter or my preparedness.
Right.
That when winter comes, no matter how I feel about it, it's going to be cold. And so to best prepare for it is to understand that maybe you need a jacket or maybe you need to store up. Is that kind of what you're saying about death and dying?
It belongs. Surely it belongs. Yeah, it's... there are always feelings about these things. Maybe we could say this. So if you appreciate poetry, then you might appreciate this analogy. The best poets don't tell you how they feel about things, so that you can bounce off their feelings with your feelings. And the things themselves completely disappear under this avalanche of feelings and associations. The best poets make the world available to you, not their feelings. I think the best dying does that.
Why in the dark, dear heart, have you come see me? Why in the world won't you say?
So how else can you be with death?
Well, maybe you could think of it as learning about death instead of learning about yourself. In order to even be able to say that sentence out loud, you have to be able to make a distinction between these two things and recognize that your death is not your personal possession. There's no such thing as your death as anything that I've ever seen. No. And it's the parallel to life is quite dramatic, and it would be this. So certain cultures in the world have death practices subsequent to the actual time of death of a person. There's various kinds of gatherings, and they often include banqueting, feasting, which is at some level would seem to be a strange response, that you feast and affirm life in the presence of the death of someone close to you. But of course, these belong together. They're not strangers. They belong where you find one, you find the other. In that sense, they're like unidentical twins. So one of the things that happens in these things, at least in the ones that I've attended, is people begin to tell stories about the dead person. And they begin to exaggerate. And the stories they're telling are not necessarily factually accurate or true, but they're more evocations of a certain sensibility, and people begin to participate, and then they begin to talk about other things not directly related to the dying person. And before you know it, the meaning of the dead person's life is beginning to be assembled by the living. The meaning of your life is not for you to authorize. The meaning of your life is a consequence of the agreement of the others around you to assign certain meaning, significance, and consequence and the rest. That's how you appear. And it's certainly how the meaning of your death begins to appear. So you don't get to be there, you see. So the answer to your question would be then, if you attend to the deaths of others in this ceremonial fashion, you begin to have a sense of what will accompany your death. By the time it's your turn, though you don't get to be there at the time, you have enough time in, culturally speaking and psychically and poetically speaking, that you have a pretty good idea what will ensue. And these people are not left to their own devices to decide what a death ritual looks like, or not shopping around between African rituals and, Native American rituals and all the rest. But there's actually a kind of cultural fidelity that's available to you there at the ending of your days. If none of that was there during your life, you can't possibly be overly shocked that it's not there at the end of your life either.
It was something to wrap my head around that my death doesn't belong to me. I thought long and hard about what Stephen might mean, and I'm not sure this is what he means, but I started to understand that my life doesn't really belong to me either. Individualism and ownership is part of the cultural programming of the dominant North American culture. Inseparable connection to anyone or anything is outside of our orientation. We think we are separate beings, yet my life doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the earth and my ancestors from which I came. It belongs to my family, my children, friends, and work to which I am responsible to, and from which I know myself. It belongs to the great mystery from which all things are possible. So if my life doesn't belong to me, then my death doesn't belong to me either. The understanding that we belong to each other and all that is, as with our life and so our death, is a huge shift in cultural understanding. And in that deep felt understanding, we can at least better attend to one another in life, if not in death.
From what I can tell, these are strange days. My corner of the world is full of rights, and people exercising them and claiming them and scrambling after them, defending them, establishing them, and writing them down. I suppose it's a good thing in some way. There's the basic human rights, need to be defended, but there's this other kind, at least where I come from. A strange category of rights. I have the right not to suffer. I heard that one a lot in the death trade. And one even more current than that is a right to disbelieve. The right to exempt yourself from the deep consideration of what pertains.
I've heard you say that we're not afraid of the things that we think we're afraid of when death comes, that we think we're afraid of the pain and suffering, but really we're afraid to be forgotten. And I've thought about that with my own life. Is that really what I'm afraid of? I think there is a sense of that, maybe. But it feels to me that the real terror is just not knowing what happens after. And there is the pain and suffering terror too, but that it seems like within the dominant culture feels like a terror that comes up is that not knowing what's beyond the veil. Because if we knew that we were going to go to a better place, and I think we're happy to be forgotten, we're going to go somewhere else cool. And I think it's tied into the poverty that you talk about, that we're so impoverished by the lack of so many things, and wanting to reach beyond an idea of the afterlife as a better idea of the current life. I can feel that reflex too.
Well, I'll say what I said earlier, that anybody who speaks with authority about what happens is a bit of a charlatan, at least. So I don't have any better idea than you do about the architecture of things. But if the question is what happens after, part of the answer to that question is, what will the other people do after you? Okay? What people do with us after we die is part of what happens to us after we die. We are, in a real sense of the term, in other people's hands. That's one. Two, you talked about not knowing, is the greater terror, which for you, okay, if it is, it is. But I would just, offer this response. We're full of information. We're engorged with information. More information now per square foot than the gods ever seem to have allowed before. Now, you would think that information would translate into something at least flirting with knowledge. And if that's true, you'd think at least some of that knowledge would flirt with wisdom. And if that's true, then you'd hope that flirting with wisdom would have some direct benefit, not just for the world, but for your dying time. If any of those other things were true, that seems to be in the realm of possibility. I look around myself and I don't see the masses of information turning into something like knowledge. I mean, we know a lot of things, factually speaking, but it doesn't look like there's a great degree of comfort that comes from the stuff that we do know. So I'd go out on a limb and suggest to you that a parallel anxiety to not knowing what happens after we die is knowing what happens before we die. That's at least as anxiety-making as the other one is. If I can judge from all the anxiety I saw with all the deaths that I attended, I think that's true.
What happens before we die?
Well, if you're asking me what I saw, that's a slightly different question. So I saw like the best medical technology available was brought to bear upon people in the last 6 weeks of their life. Why? What are we trying to rescue dying people from, since they're dying people anyhow, no matter what we do? And you know what the answer is as well as I do. Nobody wants to be accused of giving up. Nobody wants to be accused of not doing everything that can be done. But doing everything that can be done has a very dark side to it, a very perhaps unintended, but absolutely macabre consequences. Like, for example, dying people, they lose their ability to calculate where in the arc of their life they are, because their life has been extended again, and extended again, and there's no reality to the ending anymore. Then the reality of endings turns into when you finally give up and quit, that's a comment about you, not your dying. So the notion that there's a thing called the time to die is completely disappears, and it's a casualty of all our interventions. I saw that happen over and over and over again, certainly. I saw over and over again the disappearance of people's death-informed language. If they ever had it, it was gone when they needed it most. So they had rah-rah language instead. They had cheerleading language. They had positive affirmation language. They had belief language, but they didn't have death language. And so if I've done anything that is a legitimate contribution, it's probably in the realm of crafting a language in die-wise, and when I've talked about it since, where the realities of dying actually appear instead of being banished by symbolism and euphemism and allegory and, allegations and beliefs and opinions and feelings and the things that I talk about when we're talking about these things that you're asking me about now. I'm employing a language that I crafted at the deathbed. And this is one of the things that dying people are missing terribly. They're surrounded by people speaking in ways that make dying harder and harder to keep track of.
I wonder, for people who don't have the experience or privilege of being with the dying and to be in the life that we're in, it's hard to access that, and for me in my work, it's accessing pain and discomfort is something that's very tangible. We all have that, and we all have the instinct to run away from it. Accessing death without the extensive experience you've had feels very difficult. And I'd like you to talk about that.
Sure. Well, death is the consequential incarnation of what we're talking about, but it's not the only one. In other words, your death is another example of limit and frailty and boundary and inconstancy. These things are all available to you in other aspects of your life. None of them require a terminal diagnosis for you to gain access to them or to learn about them. But they do require a kind of renovation of your cultural self to the point where you realize you got to stop using language like failing. Your health is failing, for example, because you're dying. It's not failing at all. Failing to do what? Failing to resemble that of a 25-year-old? I mean, what's the standard that we're holding dying people to when we use a language where we insist on failure to thrive as a legitimate description of what dying is? Dying people have no obligation to thrive, you see. Dying people, along with late middle-aged women, last I heard, now this is some time ago, are the highest per capita consumers of antidepressants in the culture. What do they have in common, dying people and late middle-aged women? One of the things they have in common is the cultural allegation that they are beyond their use, that they have no real purpose any longer, that that's all in eclipse now. There's nothing more to wait for. There's no legitimacy to their place in life. Oh my God, when you start saying this stuff out loud and it becomes recognizable, it's no shock whatsoever that dying people are so quote-unquote depressed, or at least they're treated for depression. But if we're saying somebody's depressed, what are we saying about them? Among other things, we're saying they're not behaving well. But wait, they're dying in a death-phobic culture. What is it you expect exactly? How do you think it's going to go when people haven't lived the realities that were available to them about endings and frailties and limits before now? They did everything they could to thwart and to stymie the limits that came to them. They stayed away from them, didn't they? They refused to be educated by limits and endings and insisted these were all failures of the will. Instead, to enter in somebody's wellness world, to put that behind you. Man, what happens when you can't put it behind you? What does all this mean then, when you're not going to get well again? Now you begin to see where the, quote, the dark side of this thing comes from. It doesn't come from the dying. It comes from what preceded it. So here are a few things about the early days. I'd never say them out loud. But I'm going to tell you some things that I'd never say out loud. Nights of grief and mystery. I didn't know what that was or what it meant, or what was coming down the road towards me when I first said it. Who'd come to anything called grief and mystery? That didn't sound good at first, but it sounded right though, and it sounded just. It sounded like the world that I was born to. I knew that. And it took me a while to see it plainly. Welcome. That's what the whole thing was. Like it or not, whether it's your idea to be here or not, welcome. This invocation came all at once, and not from me. It was a roll call of the worthy, a blessing of a kind. They were telling me how to welcome them. So each night, I have to say it for the first time. This was about endings. And it was about these very days. That's all I knew. Grief, mystery. Do you know, if you see enough dying, you'll see not dying too. And seeing that will make you choose. By then, I'd seen dying, and I'd seen not dying, plenty of it. When the time came, I was going to end. That's all you can decide on. Mystery. But mystery takes the rest.
I guess the thing that I grapple with when I listen to you talk is this: death feels like something so, it's hard to really believe that I'm going to die when I feel full of life in the moment.
Right.
But what you're saying about a day-to-day experience and acceptance of frailty, limitations, endings, that there are deaths that are happening all the time. And if we don't recognize those things in our day-to-day life, that when the end comes, there's no way to be except to thrash about and deny it's happening.
Right.
How do I understand death in a way that informs my living and my life?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this goes with your conversation on elders, that recognizing that frailty or limitations gives you a certain type of wisdom.
Well, at the very least, it compromises your capacity to be stupid. I mean, we should be frank and say that when your life doesn't go well or your health doesn't go well, wisdom is not an automatic consequence of a moment like that. You still have to work like crazy to translate what limit means into something you can live, not something you vaguely tolerate. So wisdom's not inevitable here. It still needs all that psychic labor, for sure. So what we're talking about here is a kind of practice on the same level as a yoga practice or a meditation practice, a dying practice. And of course, you and I both know that a lot of these cultures who have yoga practice and so on have dying practices. Of course they do. This is part of, it's stitched right in. But man, if you happen to be part of a culture that's centered, allegedly centered around a guy who never died, what does your dying mean? It's a rather strange ideal to hold, I think.
To learn dying or to engage in a dying practice, I can't say I understand what that looks like. I know what yoga or meditation looks like, but dying, I know some people go to dying workshops where they lay in coffins, and I'm almost certain that's not what Stephen is talking about. To me, a dying practice is a living practice, the practice of letting things be, letting things go, of attending to people, places, and things with care and consideration, attending to one's own self with care and consideration, listening and learning from all people, all places, all things. I can't imagine a death practice being any more than that. Yet there is a rigor to what Stephen is alluding to, a type of psychic labor that he emphasizes that has the feeling of very hard work. And I wondered about this type of hard work, about dying. If maybe it's also part of the programming of individualism that we have to somehow bear it upon our own personal determination to get death or to learn death. So then maybe the hard work is in the deprogramming, the work to get out of the way and let things unfold according to nature. I brought this notion up to Stephen and asked him about elders. There are two things that is on my mind right now. There's the idea of working, engaging, not being a passive participant in things. And I wonder what you think about this. My ancestors come from a culture that reveres elders. So I just see you and that's engaged in me. An energetic quality about an affection and a respect that feels very automatic anytime I see an older person. It's absolutely built in. One time when I was in my 30s or something, I had this patient. He was maybe in his 80s. He was an older Black man. And he said to me, let me tell you a secret. He said, you know how young people, right? When you're young, you have nice, strong bodies. You're not doing anything. It's just given to you. Every young person is pretty much strong. It's kind of the same with wisdom. People think you earn it, but if you live long enough, it's kind of like the strong body. You just know things, which was completely different from what up to that point I had thought, which is what you're saying. And there was something about that wisdom that he gave me that liberated me from this sense of personalness about things. Like you're working hard towards wisdom. You're working, it felt
Right.
it felt refreshing, actually, his reframe of it. And I wonder what you think about that.
With all due respect, that's not what occurs to me. If this were true, that if you just hang around long enough, wisdom will just, blossom on you like fungus on a tree. If that were true, then an aging population is the best thing yet in terms of a wise population. Well, we have the most aged population that has ever been recorded in human history. We got more old people per square foot than probably have ever been anywhere. You know what I'm suggesting to you? There's a difference between being around and this thing that we're quickly referring to as wisdom. There's a vast difference between aging and elderhood. It really is. And it's observable. I wish he was right, but I don't see it. I'm not saying I don't see it that way. I mean, I literally don't see that it's an inevitable consequence of aging, that people are somehow more psychically alert, more available to younger people, more outward turned, more in the cultural redemption business than in the personal development business. Man, I mean, go to any wellness center, I don't know what you call them, adult learning center, and look who's keeping the lights on in these places. Who's paying the bills? People in their 30s, 40s, 50s? Now, you know who's there. And God bless them for trying. This is not a critique at all. I'm simply suggesting to you, people in their 70s and 80s are going to elder workshops looking for an elder.
My understanding of what he was saying is there's some value in surviving that long,
Sure.
whether it blossoms
Sure.
to full-blown wisdom or not. And it connects to why I think my ancestors knew. I don't think that every single old person had a bunch of wisdom, but that you're recognizing that in any person that's older. and that form of respect and recognition contains with it a wisdom already imparted to you to do that, to recognize that. I hear you feeling wanting of your generation, that there's no elders. And I also feel that wanting of my generation, that there's no wisdom to have just a positive regard, at the very least, a respect for older people, that
Correct.
It feels mutual to me.
I think it is. The willingness of younger people to seek out elders is one of the things that makes elders. So when young people stop seeking, there's a direct correlation consequence to older people's capacity to nurture the elder function within them and in their sphere of influence. So, you're pointing out that a cultural norm and value where you come from is the veneration of age simply because of its age. One of the dynamics of that instinct is that it's good for you too to do that.
Yeah.
The willingness to assume the posture of humility in the face of something that you haven't seen and don't understand and may never approach, depending on how your life goes. All these things have immense consequence for your ability to perhaps occupy that place someday, because you know what it is to be on the recognizing end, so that when you're on the receiving end, you'll recognize the recognition, you see, and then things are really working. But of course, that when there's a breakdown on one side or the other of the performance of any of these proper duties, the whole thing begins to atrophy, not just one element of it, because it's a dynamic relational arrangement. It's not, old people don't own elderhood. It possesses them. It lays claim to them. And there are times when it leaves them alone too. So the instinct that you've described is extremely important for the culture's health. It's very true. And as an ongoing reality, it contributes to the advent of elderhood in the culture, that kind of respect. It certainly does. And it offsets the lament over physical frailty and limitation and so on. It's a kind of trade that older people can enter into. They don't get to do these things anymore, not with any grace. But these things over here, which were never deemed to be very important, suddenly become another kind of skill that they never really valued until now. And your recognition helps them make the transition from, physical dexterity to kind of psychic and emotional and spiritual dexterity.
For me, reverence of elders is less an acknowledgement of superior wisdom or knowledge that older people embody, but more as an acknowledgement of my own limitations and ignorance as a younger person. Even when I was little, I was well aware that some adults were less than wise. Some seemed naive, some mean, downright crazy even. And yet it was with this awareness that still I submitted myself, not to the crazy, but to the natural order of things and to the mystery of it all. Humility is a type of trust in something greater, if not to an apparently wiser elder, than to the mystery of the elder herself, however she presents. It is a respect for a life journey, however it may have gone. This is ancestral knowledge that I have to work at to remember here in this culture. If there's one thing about the dominant North American culture that I find damning, it's arrogance. The notion that we can know and figure out the answers to all things, even what wisdom looks like, or how life is supposed to go, and so how death is supposed to be or not be. All these things tell of how we've positioned ourselves in life, human-centric and dominant. And we follow suit with coercion and control of all kinds. Where dominance and control is the high standard, submission is seen as foolish, trust as naive. And so it's no wonder that respect and reverence of elders as a general rule is discouraged. But could it be that our general judgment of older people as without value reflects more on the culture than on our elders? That if we weren't so certain of what value and worth looks like, and what any person can or cannot give, then we may open the door to mutual respect rather than mutual suspicion. Wisdom in any form is only shared where it can be received, and that is usually upon a ground of mutual respect and trust. I have been blessed with many elders in my life, and as I learn to cultivate more and more that ground of respect and trust, more elders appear. I told Stephen of one such dear friend and Navajo elder, Robert Yazzie. During the beginning of the pandemic, I did a lot of work in the Navajo Nation, and I have a very close friend there. He's an elder, and I went there and saw it taking away a lot of knowledge holders' lives.
Yeah.
And I was very upset about it. And I was speaking with him, and he didn't seem that perturbed. He doesn't seem perturbed about much, actually.
Yeah.
And I said to him, oh yeah, what's going to happen? All the knowledge holders are dying and taking knowledge with them. And oh my God, just, what do you think we should do? Blah, 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 blah. And he said to me, Twee, people are dying. He says, knowledge doesn't die. Wisdom doesn't go away. Nature doesn't. There are things that are always here. And I think about that all the time because for me, that's the only saving grace when I start to go into despair. I think, oh, wait, people are dying, but wisdom is here. Where is it? Where is it? Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you, number one, if that's resonant with you, and if so, how do we see it in this world now?
Okay. If I come back to the Navajo elders' observation explicitly, my own response to that would be something like, where? But knowledge doesn't die. Where doesn't it die? But knowledge doesn't disappear. Where doesn't it disappear? That's basically, I think, what you were asking me. See, I wouldn't be so quick myself to distinguish people. There are wisdoms available to us that are not human. For sure, that's true. And they make us more human by how not human they are. That's certainly true too, and I think you're alluding to that in part of your question. I think every indigenously oriented person has an understanding that the fundament of their identity doesn't come from the fact that they're human. It comes from their home place. That's explicitly what the word indigenous actually means, by the way. Indigenous is the preposition first. It locates, it answers the question, where? And then the GEN root is the same as generate, generative, generous, genteel, and I can't think of any others right now, but you get the idea. That's the root word that we could translate in English as to conceive or to create. So the character of being indigenous, the word means to be born inside. It locates your very identity as a place-based reality and not a human-centered reality. So you could say for indigenous people, if we go by that understanding, then their indigenosity is principally alive in their lived relationship to everything that's not human, including otherworldly things, and certainly including the so-called natural world. Now, it dies and it comes back, and it dies and it comes back, but it's not the same thing that comes back. I mean, when things die, they really die. That particular is really dead. But everything's not dead, not all at once. Even in the harshest winter that we have here, minus 40 and colder. Everything's not dead. We know that there's frogs that are in the mud, frozen solid. And I can't understand for the life of me how that works. But every spring, and if it's not them, it's the turtles. Where the hell did the turtles come from? It's clear that everything's not dead, even when it appears that the stillness of the season obliges you to consider that possibility. So death is real, but it's not as pervasive as the dying being might believe. Because it's not easy to be a dying person, that's for sure. But if you're dying indigenously, your deeper wish is not that you continue, but that which gave you life continues. That's your prayer, ultimately. And if that's the wisdom that the elder's referring to, then I would certainly concur.
As I listened to Stephen wondering out loud about the wisdom that my Dene mentor transmitted to me, it occurred to me that we were entering what he said through different doorways. What Stephen understood as a prayer from the dying for that which sustains life to continue even after death, I took as a statement of the presumption of that fact and an invitation to find it and know it in life. And so wisdom is here, right now, and will always be here, right now. Looking back on the interview in that spirit, all I see is a generous sharing of wisdom and instruction. That wisdom and instruction wasn't found exclusively in what Stephen was communicating, but everything and everyone that was conjured through the conversation. Ancestors, spirits, thoughts and wonderings, ease and discomfort, affirmations and doubting. Before our conversation, I shared with Stephen that I find it curious that considering we're vastly different people, he, an older man from European descent, and me, a middle-aged woman from Vietnamese descent, that I found resonant with his work at all. We had substantial conversation around that, and while I didn't include the specifics here, it absolutely informed our conversation around dying and the dominant culture of North America. Being trained in traditional Chinese medicine as I am, I couldn't help but see our conversation as an interplay of yin-yang, the ever-changing contrast and mutual dependency of seemingly opposite forces in the creation and play of life. Death as yin, life as yang. Woman as yin, man as yang. Old age as yin, youth as yang. Dark as yin, light as yang. Despair as yin, hope as yang. Stillness as yin, movement as yang. Autumn as yin, spring as yang, and so on and so forth. Yin and yang, they are inseparable, they depend on each other, require each other, inform each other, change and transform with each other. If you find one, the other is there. In Chinese medicine, as long as there is life, there is yin-yang. Death and dissolution of a being is the separation of yin-yang within that form, and so life itself is defined as yin-yang interplay. So what happens when yin-yang separate? What created yin-yang? What is the ground beneath yin-yang, if we can say it that way? What is beyond the veil? To echo Stephen's sentiments, who knows? But perhaps that's not relevant to human beings. Before trying to look past it, do we know what we are trying to look past? Can we respect the interplay of yin-yang in our lives here and now without wanting more of one thing and denying another? Can we cease to try to control life according to our preferences? Can we respect all things as interdependent, necessary, and ever-changing?
This is the easy part. Things have gone black and white now. Not simple, just clearer. What's it gonna be, friends? Saints or darkness? Everything matters now. Everything depends on how we carry ourselves, what we say. There's pressure there, and there's affliction, and there's travail, that's true. But the spirit work of our time is there. Rise up like we're persons of consequence. Not duck our heads like we're persons of interest. We're going to be somebody's ancestors someday. Rough gods. Well, they're the dark road dwellers who were left off the guest list a long time ago. They're troubled.
We're all gonna die someday. Until then, let's live fully with humility, respect, love and care for one another, and reverence to the great mystery from which we came and from which we will return. Thank you, Stephen, for wondering out loud with me about death, and thank you to you all for listening in. To find out more about Stephen Jenkinson's work, you can go to orphanwisdom.com. The music you're listening to throughout this program is that of Stephen Jenkinson's band, Nights of Grief and Mystery. Yes, he is an actual rock star. A Night of Grief and Mystery combines stories and observations from Stephen Jenkinson, drawn from his work in palliative care, with original songs from Canadian recording artist Gregory Hoskins. If you feel inspired by this show, pass it along to someone who would benefit from hearing these healing messages. For more information, you can visit bcaclinic.com/yourmedicine and tune in for new monthly shows. Goodbye for now.